Everyone, thanks for joining us this evening. We'll just give it a few minutes as we get started here and everyone starts joining us as our participants come into the room. Hope everyone's doing well. And we'll just give it another minute or so for people to join. All right, well, let's get started for this evening. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Café Scientifique from all of us at SFU's Faculty of Science. If you're one of our regulars, thank you for joining us again. And if you're new, thanks for joining us for the first time. My name is Amanda Hardy. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communication in the Faculty of Science, and I'm stepping in today on hosting duties for my colleague Cynthia Henson. She's our Manager of Outreach and Engagement. She couldn't be here today, but we want to acknowledge just the tremendous amount of work she does in managing all of our outreach programs like this and our many, many volunteers. Café Scientifique is the Faculty of Science's public seminar series where our faculty presenters share their science research and impact on our local communities or on larger societies. And today is our final seminar for this spring. We'll return again in the fall. We typically host about 6 to 8 sessions a year. They're all virtual. And of course, we'd love to hear from you and stay in touch. So after the event, you'll receive a feedback link by email if you want to share your feedback and thoughts. And if you also want to join our mailing list to receive updates to our next events, we would love to have you. I'd like to start us off this evening in a good way by acknowledging that we are very privileged to gather on the unceded and ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam people. And we thank them for having cared for and having been stewards of these lands and waters here since long before our time. And we look forward to continue working with them in partnership as we grow and build our communities together. And if you know whose territory you're currently on, I would invite you to take a moment just to reflect on this. And if you don't know whose land you're on, a great resource for more information is the website native-land.ca. There you can familiarize yourself with the Indigenous people whose land you live and work on. And if you haven't been on that site recently, it's grown to be basically a worldwide resource for Indigenous people and land. It's a pretty cool resource. Just quickly, I'll go through a few really simple house rules for this evening. So questions, we are going to let Dr. Coates go through her whole presentation before we take questions. But if you have questions, please type them in the Q&A box and we will get to them at the end of her presentation. We have time left for that. And if we do have questions that we're unable to get to in time, we'll reach out afterward by email. The chat will be turned off during the presentation, except for one point where she does have a question for you, and we're hoping you can type your answers into the chat then. The live transcript is on for your convenience. And just a friendly reminder that the event is being recorded and it will be shared afterwards. So we do share it on our website and in our YouTube playlist. So let's get into tonight's discussion. I am so pleased to introduce Dr. Alexandra Coates. She's an assistant professor in our biomedical physiology and kinesiology department, and she's the principal investigator of the exercise physiology and performance lab. Her research interests span exercise physiology, training monitoring, cardiovascular physiology, overtraining, energy availability, and wearable tech. And tonight, Dr. Coates' talk is about overtraining and the everyday athlete. And she brings not only a researcher's perspective, but also an athlete's perspective to this topic. She spent over 8 years training and racing internationally with the National Triathlon Center, and she is a former elite and age group triathlon coach. Her racing and coaching has informed many of her past and present research questions, and she's particularly interested in tonight's topic, which is exploring the effects of overtraining and underfueling in endurance sport. And I have to say, it's a perfect topic for our last seminar of the year as the weather's warming and we're all starting to think more about our summer activities. And for any of you who have been following our Canucks on their playoff run, they're going to probably need some of this advice after their playoff game tonight. So we're very excited to have you with us tonight. And over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Amanda. Oh. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen here. This one. Let's see, that's all good. Okay, so thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I can't believe so many people signed up for a 5 p.m. Zoom meeting. So thank you all for coming. I want to make sure that everything is good on your guys' end. I'm gonna assume it is since I haven't heard otherwise. But yeah, so I'm gonna be talking today about overtraining and the everyday athlete. And it's going to be centered on endurance sport because that is my bias. But I think that there's a lot of applicability to team sports, other sports, even resistance training. And I think we can get into that in the discussion if there's interest in that. So kind of jumping right in, bit about me, background, biases. So I am from Alberta, unfortunately, but I left Alberta right after high school to train in Victoria, BC with the National Triathlon Center. So I was in Victoria for 7 years. And I started my undergraduate degree at that time. Started in just a Bachelor of Science and then switched to kinesiology or applied for the kinesiology program, got into that. And really kind of met my passion for sport, my training with the science there in the kinesiology degree. And it was a very long undergraduate degree, so 7 years. I took a lot of gaps in there. But what I like about that 7-year undergraduate degree was that, you know, typically in the kinesiology path, people get into it and they think, okay, I'm going to go on into medicine or physio or chiro. And I certainly was the same way. But by the end of the 7 years, I really started getting interested in these questions that weren't being answered by the science. So, you know, what are some of these symptoms that are appearing in myself and my training and in my fellow teammates? You know, this kind of overtraining, or is it underfueling? What are some of these hormone disturbances that we're seeing? What's causing it? You know, the coaches couldn't answer those questions. The physiologists couldn't answer those questions. And so that really kind of sparked my interest in exercise physiology research. So after my 7 years in Victoria, I actually moved out to Guelph in Ontario. And it wasn't to start my master's right away. It was actually to do a year of training and racing with the new national team coach there in Guelph. And so I didn't do school at this time. It was my best racing season. I actually won elite Canadian nationals that year. So really was kind of on this triathlon path. But at the end of that year, I realized I had secured funding for a master's. So I had applied, didn't really think I would get it. I did get the funding. And so now I had a very hard, decision of whether or not to start my master's or continue on with triathlon. And this was leading into the Rio 2016 Olympics. So, as triathletes do, I decided to try and do both. And so I tried to do my master's and train for triathlon. And I would say that did not go well. It was this perfect storm of learning about overtraining and overreaching, because that's what I wanted to do my master's study on, and also experiencing it myself. So it's kind of, a great learning opportunity, not so great from the experiencing it perspective. And by the end of that year, that first year of my master's, I ended up, essentially not being able to train. I couldn't function, and I quit triathlon and then started my research journey. So I did 2 years of my master's with Dr. Jamie Burt at the University of Guelph Human Performance and Health Research Lab. Then I continued on, did 5 years of PhD with Dr. Jamie Burt, kind of switched it over into exercise-induced cardiac fatigue type research. Then I did a year of postdoctoral fellowship with Dr. Martin Gabala at McMaster University. So he's the high intensity interval training kind of guru. And then I started here at Simon Fraser University. So just started in September. I'm building up my lab, and I'm really kind of interested in researching some of these conditions further. So kind of this intersection between overreaching, overtraining, and underfueling, which we will talk about today. So getting into kind of areas of research, the umbrella term for my research is exercise physiology, but I have kind of dabbled in many different areas of exercise physiology. So on the top right there, overtraining and ultramarathon. So I put those together to kind of describe, what happens when we do too much, right? The kind of far end of the spectrum of exercise. And then we also have low energy availability. So what's happening when we're not fueling appropriately for our training. Then kind of another umbrella term, so performance. How do we improve athletic performance in athletes? Cardiovascular adaptation, so how does the heart and vasculature adapt to different types of training stimuli? Cardiac fatigue, so my PhD was all on this exercise-induced cardiac fatigue and trying to answer this question of, does the heart itself get tired when we are doing too much exercise or high intensity intervals and stuff like that. And then lastly, wearable technology. So trying to see if we can use some of these new technologies to monitor some of this maladaptation and then ideally prevent it, right, in our athletes. So before I really dive into overtraining, I kind of wanted to hit home the point that exercise is still good for you. I think we all know this. This is kind of the side of exercise physiology or exercise science that we typically talk about, which is that exercise is good. And I think it's pretty true to say that exercise is medicine. So I have there a picture of myself with my knee in a brace. And so this was after ACL reconstructive surgery. And, I was certainly very depressed at that time. I couldn't exercise. And I feel like anyone who's used to being able to exercise and then has that taken away from them, you start to feel the symptoms of that, right? And we know that, of course, physical activity is going to improve all organ systems in the body, metabolically, can reduce obesity, prevent type 2 diabetes, some types of cancer, skeletal, your bones, it's going to improve bone health, reduce risk of falls, hormonal systems, many hormones are going to be positively impacted by physical activity, neurological, memory, attention, just brain health in general, improved with physical activity. On the muscular side, of course, improved strength and fitness, but also just preventing atrophy as we age. And then, of course, cardiovascular. So, reducing hypertension, stroke, coronary artery disease. Many of these cardiovascular diseases can be completely prevented with exercise. So there's a quote here from a paper from Manini who says, there's no medication treatment that can influence as many organ systems in a positive manner as can physical activity. So really kind of hitting home that exercise can be considered medicine. So because of that, we have Canadian physical activity guidelines. And just as a fun little exercise here, as quickly as possible, before you overthink it, I want you guys to type in the chat what those physical activity guidelines are. So how many minutes per week and of what type of exercise? And let's see what you guys can come up with. Can't see the chat. Oh, there we go. Let's see. So good. Nice. This person says stairs 21 flights up, elevator down, repeat 8 times. That sounds really hard. All right. Okay, so the official Canadian physical activity guidelines, we have them presented as 24 hours. But essentially the number I was looking for was that 150 minutes per week of moderate to vigorous aerobic physical activity. So that is above your kind of light physical activity. You actually need to be getting your heart rate up, getting a bit of a, your breathing rate up. It has to be a bit of a sweat going. And you want to do that for about 5 times 30 minutes in the week, or accumulate 150 minutes. You also need to be trying to do 2 sessions per week of muscle strengthening activities, which is, I think, an area that a lot of people miss. Even myself, it's easy to get into the kind of aerobic exercise train and forget to do any strength training at all. And then, of course, we're trying to move as much as possible as well on top of that. So reducing our sedentary behavior, moving more, even if it's just, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, stuff like that. And sleep. Sleep is good for you. So those are the Canadian Physical Activity Guidelines. And it's worth doing a little audit and, just seeing how good am I actually doing at meeting these guidelines or exceeding them. We know we're in the midst of an inactivity crisis. So the World Health Organization says that over a quarter of adults are insufficiently active. In Canada, 53% of people, not athletes, are meeting Canada's physical activity guidelines, and only 28% are meeting the youth guidelines. There are 7 diseases that are consistently shown to be associated with low physical activity. So coronary artery disease, stroke, hypertension, colon cancer, breast cancer, type 2 diabetes, and osteoporosis. And we know there's many other diseases that'll probably benefit. The risk will go down with exercise, but these are the ones that are very consistently shown to be associated with low physical activity. And then if you're a numbers person, you like to think about money. I'm not, but put it in here. The estimated Canadian healthcare costs of physical inactivity right now are about $3.9 billion from indirect and direct causes. And we know that if only 10% of Canadians were more active, it could save $629 million per year. So certainly there's a huge cost to this inactivity crisis. So then the question becomes, can you have too much of a good thing, right? If this talks about overtraining, can you have too much exercise? And I do like to point out that there is an inverted U curve of pretty much anything. So chances are you can have too much of a good thing. I like to think about water. We're told to drink a lot of water, but if you drink too much water, you'll, become hyponatremic and die. So you can have too much of a good thing. And how does that fit in with training and exercise? So to start, let's look at elite athletes and longevity. So elite athletes, we can assume are training the most out of everybody in the world. Some endurance athletes are training 20, 30 plus hours a week. And that's not time spent getting to the gym, but actually exercising. So they're exercising a lot. And how does that kind of tie into their lifespan? Well, this first study, Mansager and colleagues, so what we have here on the y-axis is survival probability. So a higher number means better survival. And they looked at it over about a 10-year period in these groups of people. And they separated their groups out by elite athletes, elite performance at the top here, and then the lowest performance at the bottom. What you can see is that the people who had the lowest performance had also the lowest survival probability, and the elite athletes had the highest survival probability. So these authors concluded that cardiorespiratory fitness is inversely associated with long-term mortality, and there's no observed upper limit of benefit. So at least in this case, when we're talking about longevity, maybe more is better. There's a similar study. This one was actually in a 46-year follow-up just in men. And our y-axis here is inverted. So now we have death on the y-axis. So a higher number is worse. You have a greater incidence of death. And what they found, once again, was if you have the below lower limit of normal VO2 max, so normal kind of aerobic fitness, you're going to have higher incidence of death. And then if you're above the upper limit, so you're those elite performers, now you have the lowest incidence of death. So once again, kind of showing that, fitness equals longer lifespan, or at least a decreased chance of dying. So what about overtraining, right? We haven't even gotten into really overtraining, and how does that fit in with this broader perspective that exercise is good for us, right? So first I'm going to kind of define my terms here. So we know that in order to have any sort of adaptation to training, you need to have overload, right? So if we're looking just at this blue line, every one of these kind of dips here is that overload where we have a bit of acute fatigue. We have, some muscle breakdown. We need to adapt to that stimulus. And so we recover from that, hours, maybe a day or two. We bounce back and we have this micro super compensation. And over time, we have, these kind of additions of these micro super compensations. And eventually we get a performance enhancement. So we know that, is how training works. On the overtraining side of this training spectrum, it's if we have too much of that training or maybe insufficient recovery, and we simply aren't able to get back up to our baseline before we hit it with another stimulus. And now we're going to start going down, following this red line, down what we call the overtraining spectrum. And that's where we can get into a bit of trouble. So looking at my terms here, we have our training overload that should cause acute fatigue. That's a normal response to training. And that acute fatigue should last a couple hours, maybe a couple days at most. But, you have that day of recovery, you bounce right back. You should be able to perform, even if you feel a little bit tired or even if your muscles are sore, you still are able to perform if you absolutely have to. If, let's say, you do this big training block, so you do 2 to 3 weeks, super hard, I call it training camp stress, you can get to a state of functional overreaching. And what differs between functional overreaching and acute fatigue is just this sustained depression in performance. So you aren't able to perform, even if, gun to your head, all the motivation in the world, your body simply cannot perform. And that will last for days to weeks. You might have a micro super compensation when you recover from that. You might not. And then going on to non-functional overreaching. So this is when you have this sustained decrease in performance. Maybe you tried to train through the functional overreaching, and now we're in this kind of deep hole that's going to last weeks to months. And you certainly won't have any super compensations when you recover from this because it's just such a lengthy time of recovery. So you're going to be detrained when you get out of it. And then lastly, we have overtraining syndrome, which is seen at the very far end of the spectrum. We don't fully understand it, but it is a complex syndrome that is going to have a lot of physiological issues associated with it, and it will last for months to years. Of the athletes that I know who kind of fit this criteria of overtraining syndrome, none of them have been able to return to elite sport. So we don't want to get there. That being said, I think it's very rare for people to get to this state of overtraining syndrome. And typically, when people think that they're in overtraining syndrome, they're in non-functional overreaching. So it's very rare and very difficult to get to a state of overtraining syndrome. And we'll talk about that in a bit as well. So prior to my master's research on overreaching and then some of my later PhD work with overreaching, we did have a set of known kind of signs and symptoms of overreaching. So what was known? We know, of course, that overreaching is characterized by decreased performance. That's kind of the definition of overreaching. It's what separates it from acute fatigue is you have this reduction in performance. And we also know that you're going to see a decrease in exercising heart rate. So you're going to have a decrease in peak heart rate. You simply can't hit the same max heart rate that you usually can. It'll be suppressed by about 5 to 10 beats per minute. But you'll also have a decrease in submaximal exercising heart rate. So usually at intensities above about 70% of max, you're going to have this reduction by about 5 to 10 beats. And I'm sure some of you are now thinking, hey, but that's what happens when you have an increase in fitness, right? True, that is what happens with fitness. But this is a very acute response. You're going to go one day, one day you're biking at 200 watts, and that's usually a heart rate of 160. And then the next day you're biking at 200 watts and your heart rate is now 150 and you feel tired. There's your distinguishing factor there is you feel tired and your heart rate is suppressed. Increased exercising effort, right? So it feels harder. You can't get your heart rate up. The given load, it's just, it feels like you're fatigued. That's how you will know whether you're overreached or if you have improved. You're also going to have a decrease in circulating blood lactate. So I know right now there's a big trend in just kind of recreational sport for people to be doing their own blood lactate testing. So if that happens to be you, you will see a decrease in circulating blood lactate as well as that decrease in exercising heart rate. at intensities over about 70% of your max. You're going to have a decrease in mood states. In my studies, this was characterized by emotional volatility. So lots of crying, a little bit of outburst anger. You just kind of lose a bit of control of your mental, emotional states, which I'm sure everyone who's been fatigued can understand. And then lastly, I have altered autonomic function with a question mark. So kind of popular media would say you can use heart rate, resting heart rate, and heart rate variability to tell you whether or not you are overtrained. And I'm going to say that at least prior to my research, you couldn't, and I would still say that stands. So you can't really use heart rate variability. What we really didn't know is what was happening to the autonomic nervous system with overreaching. So remember, autonomic nervous system is separated into two branches. You've got your sympathetic arm, which is your fight or flight response. You have your parasympathetic side, which is like rest and digest. And in the research, using heart rate variability to try to measure this autonomic function, they would see sometimes increases in the sympathetic activity, so stressful state. And in other studies, you would actually see an increase in the parasympathetic side, so a more kind of fatigued, restful state, let's call it. And so we didn't really know what was going on there. And that led to my first master's study with overreaching, which was looking at the cardiovascular and autonomic alterations that occur with functional overreaching, or that kind of training camp stress. So to look at this, we did a big training camp type study. So we had endurance athletes, and these were just recreational endurance athletes, not elites, not pros, but they were mostly triathletes or cyclists. And they came in and did, first of all, just a kind of reduced training week. So we wanted to make sure that they were rested before we did our initial baseline testing. And then the control group continued on with their normal training for 3 weeks. So we asked them to maintain their volume, their intensity, their duration of their training, and do that for 3 weeks, and then do another recovery week. Now our overload group had the pleasure of doing their normal training. So they still had to maintain their regular training, regular intensity, but on top of that, come in for some very intense sessions in the lab, in addition to their normal training. And with that, they did that for 3 weeks. And by the end of it, these athletes were very tired. We were seeing underperformance. We were seeing that suppression in heart rate. We were seeing that suppression in exercising lactate. So we knew that they were overreached. So the exercise sessions that these athletes would come in for, I'm not sure if some of you have heard of Wingate tests before, but Wingate test essentially is a 30-second, they call it a super maximal exercise test. And what happens is you sprint as fast as you can, and then a load drops, and you get to sprint against that load for 30 seconds. And usually when we do this in the lab with undergrads, about half of them will then get off the bike and puke. But we had our athletes do this 4 to 6 times, separated by 4 minutes. And this was, once again, on top of their regular training, and they would come into the lab and do this 2 times per week for the 3 weeks, and would also do some time trials and performance tests for us as well. So here's just the first, couple seconds of a Wingate test. And that is a puke bucket being held next to him. And at the end of a session of these 4 to 6 Wingates, you're very tired. So the athletes would be pretty messed up after this, and that was kind of the point of the study. So some of the cardiovascular and autonomic measures that we were looking for in this first study, we used cardiac impedance to look at an indirect measure of cardiac output. So how much blood can the heart pump out during exercise? We also used this novel method of measuring the autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic side. And so this is a method called muscle sympathetic nerve activity. And what you do is you place this micro electrode, this needle, into a peripheral nerve, and then find a sympathetic fiber within that nerve, and then record the sympathetic bursts being delivered to that nerve. And so with this, we get a direct measure of the sympathetic activity in the body. And it looks something like this. So every one of these bursts is a sympathetic burst, and you simply count them. And yeah, an increase in sympathetic activity is characterized by more bursts. We also wanted to look at arterial function, so arterial stiffness. A greater stiffness is typically related to decreased health. So you can think of, increased stiffness is going to raise blood pressure, and it's going to be a greater load that the heart has to work against. So we want to have very compliant, flexible arteries. So we wanted to see what overtraining would do to the arteries. And then lastly, we did some heart rate variability, baroreflex sensitivity to also get at that autonomic side indirectly. And some of our results, so starting off first with the arterial stiffness, I'll orient you to this figure. So we have pulse wave velocity on the y-axis. So a greater pulse wave velocity means greater stiffness, and remember, stiffness is bad. We have pre-post the 3 weeks of overload training. Our overload group was in the black circles and the control group is in the clear circles. So you can see after this 3 weeks of training, there was an increase in arterial stiffness just in the overload group. So we would say that's not good. They had an increase in that, stiffness, which would place a greater load on the heart. And then maybe because of that, we actually see a decrease in the maximal cardiac output during exercise. So the heart was unable to pump out as much blood during maximal exercise, which would certainly decrease endurance performance. From the sympathetic side, so if we're looking at our muscle sympathetic nerve activity here, we can see that the overload group had an elevation in the sympathetic nerve activity. And this is pretty interesting because if we're just looking at regular training studies and just kind of month to month, year to year, most people have a very stable sympathetic tone, if you will. So the fact that we saw this increase in sympathetic nerve activity, much higher burst frequency here, shows that they were in a stressful state. They did have that increase in the fight or flight response that was quite sustained. And then lastly, so I have here cardiac baroreflex sensitivity. So this is a measure of your body's ability to maintain blood pressure. This was the same results as we also saw in the heart rate variability side. And what's interesting here is that our overload group actually didn't have a change. So this is what we see typically in the literature too, where we're not really seeing a change in heart rate variability. We're not seeing it there. But what we did see was that, what we did see was that the control group had an increase in their heart rate variability and their baroreflex sensitivity. So our conclusion from that was that the overreached athletes had a blunting of this kind of beneficial health effect, right? So if you just do your regular training, your recreational athlete, you might have improvements in heart rate variability, improvements in baroreflex sensitivity or blood pressure regulation, just because exercise is good for you, right? Whereas this overload group no longer got those health benefits. So that was my master study. Then I went on and I looked more on the cardiac side, exercise-induced cardiac fatigue for my PhD. But near the end of the PhD, we got interested in looking at kind of some metabolic disturbances with overreaching, primarily because this study came out that showed that in sedentary individuals, so these weren't athletes, when they did a 3-week very hard training block, they had decreases in glucose tolerance. So they were unable to handle a glucose load as well as they did before the training block. And they had a decrease in mitochondrial function. So, this, although they didn't use the term overreaching in this study, it kind of sparked our interest and we wondered what would happen with athletes. We also wondered if we could use continuous glucose monitors to monitor the athletes during these overtraining blocks, because maybe that would be a useful tool for athletes to use in the field, right? So we did a very similar study as the previous one, 3 weeks of overload, lots of Wingates, 4 Wingates, 5 Wingates, 6 Wingates, 2 times a week, all these exercise tests, really tried to smash the athletes as much as we could in that 3-week block. And for the testing days, we had them come in. They did a mood state questionnaire, we took blood, and then they drank 50 grams of glucose through Trutol. For those of you who have taken the oral glucose tolerance test, you drink this super sweet beverage, it's awful, and you see how much your blood sugar spikes. So they took that, waited 15 minutes to make sure that the glucose was in their bloodstream, and then they did this submaximal exercise test. So this is a Lambert submaximal cycling test. And what you do is you do 6 minutes at 60% of heart rate max, 6 minutes at 80% of heart rate max, 3 minutes at 90% of heart rate max. And essentially we were looking at glucose throughout these time periods, but you would also look at power output throughout here if you wanted to assess overreaching status. So remember, because your heart rate is suppressed with overreaching, to hit these heart rate zones, you actually have to work harder. So on the bike, the power outputs would be higher in order to hit that, and the RPE, so the effort would also be higher. So this is kind of a monitoring tool for overreaching in and of itself. Just looking at the glucose data, because that's what we're interested in here. So we have the pre-overload training in the black circles, we have post in the squares, and then recovery in the triangles. And you can see that after the overload block, and this is just in the submaximal cycling part, the Lambert submaximal cycling test, you can see that circulating glucose was suppressed using the continuous glucose monitors. So that is telling us that there's less circulating glucose. And then interestingly, we also found that there was less carbohydrate utilization during the exercise as well. So athletes were simply unable to use carbohydrate to the same degree following the overreaching as they had been previously. And this also would tie into performance. So we know that you need carbohydrate to perform well. You need to be able to use it to perform well. So this could tie into performance. And then it also does tell us that maybe athletes could use these continuous glucose monitors to detect whether or not they're overreached in training. And you could use a standardized warm-up similar to the Lambert submaximal cycling test, where you're doing standardized loads and looking at, glucose response, heart rate response, effort. If you had lactate, you could do lactate. So kind of summary of the findings and how it added to the overreaching literature. We now know that overreaching does increase sympathetic activity in the body. We still might not be able to use heart rate variability to detect it, but we do know that the body's in a more stressful state. We know that it's going to increase arterial stiffness. This likely leads to a decrease in exercising cardiac output, so we're not able to pump out as much blood during exercise. Blunting of beneficial health adaptations, so you're not going to have those same improvements in cardiovascular and autonomic function as you would if you just were training regularly. And decreased circulating glucose and glucose utilization during exercise. So that's all well and good, but you will notice that a lot of that was very health-oriented, health-focused, right? And a lot of coaches and athletes don't really care about health. They couldn't care less. But what they care about is training adaptations and ultimately performance. So a lot of coaches want to know, is functional overreaching still necessary to then go into a taper period, have a recovery block, and have an optimal super compensation, right? Do we need to do these training camps where we really smash these athletes, maybe get them to a state of overreaching, but then have them recover? And is that going to be how we get peak performance? So there's this awesome study, Aubrey and colleagues in 2014, and they looked at exactly that. So here on the x-axis, we have pre and post a 3-week training block, all right? Very similar to my study. I think I actually modeled it after their study, so that's why. So 3 weeks of training, and what we have here is we have change in performance on the y-axis, and we have from T1 to T4, it's the taper weeks. So these are all recovery weeks following the 3-week training block. And if we're looking just at the squares, so this is the control group, they just did their normal training for 3 weeks. And you can see that following the 3 weeks, maybe this tiny improvement in performance just from training regularly. And then it actually gets better after a week of recovery and then kind of plateaus here. So that's the control group. Looks good, looks healthy, training works. Functioning overreach group. So they did 3 weeks of overload training. It was at about 130% of the regular load. This was in triathletes, I believe. And you'll notice that they had this decrease in performance following the 3-week training block. That is what characterizes them as functioning overreach, right? Decrease in performance. And then they did a week of recovery. You'd see they bounced back and maybe they had a tiny, tiny super compensation, but you'll notice that they had worse super compensation than if they had just maintained their regular training, like the control group. So, would not suggest that this is beneficial. And then you can see that they essentially dropped right off and did worse than the control group. And then lastly, we have the acutely fatigued group. So they did the 3-week training camp. They got tired, but they weren't underperforming by the end of it. So maybe these athletes were, better trained coming into it. Maybe they were better rested coming into it. Maybe it's just individual differences, but they were able to handle the load. They didn't become functionally overreached. And then you'll notice over 2 weeks of taper, they had this huge super compensation, definitely got the most out of their recovery here, and then, started detraining over weeks 3 and 4. So I would say this is pretty strong evidence, this plus all of the kind of detrimental health effects that we just talked about, that, we want to avoid functional overreaching. We want to avoid digging holes. So I would say you would essentially want to stick within this acute fatigue box as much as possible when you're prescribing exercise, when you're monitoring exercise, and really, really trying to avoid any underperformance and the associated physiological consequences of functional overreaching and non-functional overreaching. Another question that often comes up then is, are there long-term consequences to functional overreaching, non-functional overreaching, and overtraining syndrome? So there is a theory. There is a theory that functional overreaching and non-functional overreaching might cause some of these potentially pathological cardiovascular changes that we see in some athletes. So we do see some athletes have increased atrial fibrillation. They might have myocardial fibrosis, aortic dilation, coronary artery calcification. Now, whether or not that's related to overreaching is unknown. So it could just be something that happens with a lot of training. Or it could be that these athletes were pushing harder and they were becoming overreached more often. We don't really know. So this is definitely an area for future research. And then on the overtraining syndrome side, certainly this has long-term consequences. So the symptoms, characteristics of overtraining syndrome very closely resemble chronic fatigue syndrome. So you're going to have post-exertional malaise. You simply cannot exercise, profound exhaustion, all of these symptoms that very badly impact your life. That being said, we don't believe that overtraining syndrome can be caused simply from training too much. So even within the definition of overtraining syndrome, they say it likely has some other factors going on that will drive this. It's confusing because then if we find those other factors, now it usually then is no longer called overtraining syndrome, right? But essentially, is there a viral load? Is there underlying energy deficiencies? What else might have kind of gone into this overtraining syndrome? All that is to say, very unlikely that you would get to a point of overtraining syndrome with simply training too much. That being said, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, because I've certainly known a number of athletes who have had to retire from their sport because of it. When we're looking at the available evidence for overtraining syndrome, a recent systematic review came out and they actually found 0 studies. There are 0 studies out there where they were actually looking at overtraining syndrome. So once again, we really don't know what's going on here. And then lastly, there's this intersection here between overtraining syndrome and relative energy deficiency in sport. So this study was trying to look at the shared pathways, shared symptoms. And what they found was that in most cases, when the study purported to look at overtraining syndrome, first of all, they were actually looking at non-functional overreaching. So those studies weren't actually looking at overtraining syndrome. And then when they were looking at non-functional overreaching, most of those cases were actually energy deficiencies. So the athletes weren't taking in enough calories, and that explained a lot of their symptoms. So now getting into, is it overreaching or is it low energy availability? All right. So when I'm talking about low energy availability, there's this whole host of kind of physiological consequences that come from not taking in adequate calories to support your training. These would go towards your normal physiological function, right? So this started off as the female athlete triad. It was 1980s, 1990s. Dr. Barbara Drinkwater started realizing that female gymnasts who were amenorrheic, so they didn't have a period. They were developing stress fractures in their spines. So they had osteoporosis in their spines. And she realized that their healthy teammates who had normal menstrual function, they had normal bone health, and they also were eating a lot more. So she developed this female athlete triad that essentially demonstrated that low energy availability would drive a reduction in menstrual function, and this would also lead to a decreased bone health. Now, Margot Mountjoy in 2014 came out with this new relative energy deficiency in sport model. And this just expanded the triad model. So now she's recognizing that there are many other systems that are going to be impacted by low energy availability, and men are included. So men are not, lucky and don't have to worry about this. They will have the same set of symptoms as females. Only, of course, we're not so much worried about menstrual function, but they can have decreased sex hormones as well. So decreased testosterone. This REDS, so relative energy deficiency in sport, can have long-lasting impact on bone, reproductive, and metabolic health. And the prevalence is very high. So there's actually, in Dr. Mountjoy's most recent paper, she actually found that the prevalence can be higher than 58%. It can be up to 70% in some sports of low energy availability. So it's going to depend on the sporting type, the athlete type, how we measured it, but it's certainly very high prevalence amongst many sports. When we're looking for markers of this, so it's going to differ from overreaching in that with overreaching, I tend to say you can detect it during exercise. So you can't really do a blood test. You can't, there's not a lot of resting measures to look at overreaching. But with low energy availability, you're going to detect it with blood tests and with some of these resting measures. So in the early phases of a period of low energy availability, you can look for trends, decreases in some of these blood markers. So leptin, thyroid hormone T3, IGF-1. So that's kind of a growth hormone that'll be suppressed. And we actually have an increase in the actual growth hormone. I kind of think of that as a stress response. But some of these blood markers are going to be altered just even in the first couple weeks of low energy availability. We might have an initial weight loss. So think about, you're taking in less calories. You might have an initial weight loss. Decrease in resting blood pressure and heart rate. And for females who are not on hormonal birth control, you can have an increase in menstrual disturbances. And then so weeks to months of this, now we're going to have more blood markers that are going to be showing up. So decreased ferritin, glucose, insulin, follicular stimulating hormone, increase in cortisol. And now we're actually going to have weight stabilization. And the big reason for this is because when we're in this starvation mode, our resting metabolic rate is going to be suppressed. And this is quite severe. Your body's trying to conserve calories as much as possible. Think about a triathlete who's training 20 to 30 hours a week and not taking in enough calories. Your body's going to be trying as hard as possible to save any extra energy and save those calories to go towards health and function, right? So weight actually stabilizes. And this is super important for coaches and athletes to recognize, in that you can't tell if an athlete is in a state of REDS just by looking at their, body mass. You can have very skinny athletes who are in energy balance, who are good, and you can have, athletes who look as though they're good and they're certainly not. All right, so you can't tell just from looking at an athlete. When you're in, weeks and months of this, now you're going to start seeing these stress reactions. You can detect, risk scores using some questionnaires, so LEAF-Q, LEAM-Q, of course, more menstrual disturbances in female athletes. And then finally, if you have months to years of this, now our sex hormones are certainly impacted. You're actually going to see an increase in blood cholesterol, weight stabilization or weight gain through water retention, increased stress fractures. So now this is the athletes where every year they start having a stress fracture. You're going to have more questionnaires, of course, that'll show up as positive risk scores. And then, in female athletes, you can have full-blown amenorrhea where they stop having a period altogether. So kind of long-term consequences of REDS. Big one is going to be bone. We know that peak bone formation occurs by age 19 in women and about 21 in men. And that after those ages, your bone mineral density is just going to kind of decrease for the rest of your life. So in these key young athlete periods of time, it's really crucial that they be building up that bone mineral density. And unfortunately, this is also the time when a lot of athletes start getting into the phase of low energy availability, especially in female athletes, because now you're starting to have some of that fat accumulation that comes with puberty, which is normal, healthy response to being a woman. But then what happens is because of societal pressures, sporting pressures, you might have a dip in performance, causes these athletes to then calorically restrict. They're going to eat less to try and improve their performance or from a body image perspective. And that's that key time when they're supposed to be building their bone mineral density. And then you have athletes who are in their 20s with osteoporosis. I can think of athletes who have fallen in the snow, when they're in their 20s and broke a hip, just like you would expect of, an 80-year-old. So this is definitely one of the biggest consequences of REDS. Of course, there's going to be a loss of adaptation to training, simply because if you think about, that the overtraining spectrum that we talked about at the start, where you do need to adapt to the training just to get that little bit better, have those super compensations. If you can't get there, if you can't get back to your baseline and improve, then you're going to have a decreased adaptation to the training. Inability to lose weight. So loss of control of your metabolism, that's because of that suppression of the basal metabolic rate. And so now, by calorically restricting further, you're not going to lose weight. You're going to conserve even more. And so this can be very frustrating for athletes. There's athletes who really do need to have that control. They need to make weight classes or, what have you. Reduced fertility, of course, both sexes. And then lastly, thyroid dysfunctions. So this will present as hypothyroidism. We know that thyroid medications would make this worse because it's going to increase that resting metabolic rate, increase the energy deficit, and cause greater symptoms. So it's really important that people have an understanding of REDS, physicians have an understanding of REDS, so we don't mistake thyroid dysfunctions for REDS or vice versa. And lastly, kind of like I did with the overreaching, kind of like who cares about health? What about performance? And so one question that we had, and that a lot of sports scientists have, is what is driving underperformance? Is it overreaching or is it low energy availability? And of course, this is a complex question. We know that, training stress, increasing training load is going to increase the exercising energy expenditure. So there's just this interplay. Similarly with recovery, in order to recover, we need to have sufficient energy intake. So obviously it's almost impossible to completely separate these two, but we tried to do that. So me and a colleague, Megan Pikeman and Dr. Jamie Burr, we did a systematic review and meta-analysis where we looked at as many studies as we could find where they did at least a 2-week training block, where they had markers of low energy availability at pre and at post, and had performance markers at pre and at post. And what we found was that 60% of the studies following that training block, normal adaptation to training, no markers of low energy availability, no underperformance. Now, if we look over here at the top, we had 7 studies, so 11%, where they were underperforming following the training block, but there was no markers of low energy availability present. So we would say that these were just overreached athletes. In the middle here, 7 studies where there was both. So there's underperformance and markers of low energy availability. And then at the bottom, we had 11 studies where there was markers of low energy availability, but no decrease in performance. So maybe even just maintenance or improvement. Kind of diving a little bit deeper here, just at these low energy availability results. So you see here, we have the standardized mean difference in exercise performance before and after a training block of over 2 weeks in athletes with the markers of low energy availability. So if you look here, we've got performance, it either decreased on this side or increased on this side, and these are all the different studies. And this little blue diamond indicates the overall mean of all these studies. So you can see that overall mean, there's no change in performance when you have markers of low energy availability. That being said, you can see, half of these studies, there was actually improvements in performance. And then, on this side, we had a number of studies where there's a decrease in performance. So what this is telling us is that there are certainly cases where you can be in a state of low energy availability, and it's not necessarily going to impact your performance, at least for the short term. And so, you know, maybe there's phases where you might have a bit of weight loss, you have some symptoms of low energy availability, but it equates to an improved performance for this period of time before you start having stress fractures or increased illness or whatever. And so you can kind of get away with it. But then, of course, there are cases where the energy deficit is going to drive a decrease in performance. So our conclusions from this review were that underperformance can occur independent of low energy availability. So that tells us that overreaching does exist independent of the energy side. And that low energy availability does not necessarily result in underperformance, although it can. And that in general, remember 60% of our studies, most training blocks do not result in underperformance or symptoms of low energy availability. So you don't have to be super scared of training, just recognize that there are some risks. So this is basically kind of the end of my talk here, but I wanted to bring it back to, you know, the everyday athlete and who is at risk of overtraining and relative energy deficiency in sport. And of course, we have our elite athletes, right? You know, we talk about them, certainly they're at risk. But I actually would almost suggest that recreational and age group athletes are more at risk than elite athletes. And the reason for that is because they are not as able to control their lives. So elite athletes, you know, they have to worry about their nutrition, they worry about their sleep, they worry about their training, and they try to cut out all of those extra variables. Most of them don't have jobs as well. They don't have kids and families. So they don't have all these other stressors that are going to go into maybe increasing an energy deficit or causing more stress that can lead to overreaching. So I would say that these athletes might be at even greater risk than elite athletes. I would also suggest that all exercising individuals who do not increase caloric intake sufficiently are certainly at risk for REDS. And I found when I was coaching that if you take a kind of normal athlete and you start them on a triathlon training program, most of them won't increase their caloric intake enough. And it's because they're simply not used to it. So they don't pack a big enough lunch when they go to work. They're just not used to eating all day long because they never had to before. And so those individuals are going to be at risk for REDS specifically. Parents or professionals who are stretched too thin, kind of exactly like I already talked about, we have this overlying life stress. And then if on top of that, you're trying to train quite a lot, you're certainly at risk for both overtraining and REDS. And then of course, we've got people who develop unhealthy relationships with exercise or nutrition. So our exercise dependencies and disordered eating or eating disorders. So we're gonna leave it at kind of what do you guys think? Considering that elite athlete, you know, longevity, that we know that elite athletes live the longest, should we even be worried about overtraining? Further, you know, given epidemic of obesity and low activity levels, are people gonna exercise less now that I do this talk on overtraining? And is the everyday athlete really at risk of overtraining? So I'd like you guys to just kind of think about this and we can talk about it in the discussion here. And that is all for me. Thank you. I'm going to stop my share for now.
Thanks so much, Alex. There was a ton of really good information in your talk, and there's already some questions coming through. There's been some throughout the discussion, so we'll jump right in. And some of these may have come in during certain points of your presentation, so I'm not sure exactly if they relate to a particular topic that you were talking about. We might have to ask those people to like add context if we're not able to figure it out. But the first one is from Eric L. And he's asking, can coenzyme Q improve mitochondrial function?
I'm going to go with, I'm not the person to ask about that specifically. I know that there's some research being done on this. I think as with any kind of supplement, anything where we know it can help in the body, but taking it as a supplement, then it becomes an additional, you know, is it bioavailable? Can our bodies even use it? I'm not sure. So unfortunately, I don't really know the answer to that question.
Okay, thank you. Ranbir had a question, and this is one that might need more context, but it says, any effects on immune function, like more or less likely to get colds?
Both overreaching and REDs, low energy availability, are associated with a decreased immune function. So yeah, we do see with functional overreaching, more greater likelihood of getting sick, and then same with REDs or low energy availability. That being said, as with a lot of these symptoms, more research is needed because we haven't really been able to disentangle some of this. So is it the energy or is it the overreaching that is causing this decrease in immune function? So yeah, at the moment, I would say both, but yeah, more research is needed. Chances are you will get sick when you're run down. So yeah.
Great, thank you. This is from one of our attendees who might have missed this in the first part of the presentation. And the question is there a sign of overreaching that we could indicate during one set of workouts, ostensibly, so that we could prevent it?
Yeah. Yeah. So I do like the idea of a standardized warm-up. Maybe well, no, I'll just talk it out. So yeah, the Lambert submaximal cycling test where you do a stage at about 60% of max and then a stage at 80% and then like 3 minutes at 90%. And with the Lambert's test, they're doing it based off of percent of max heart rate. You could kind of drop that down if you wanted to do it as power outputs on the bike or running intensities or something. But essentially what you want to see is either a suppression in heart rate, if you have lactate, a suppression in lactate, if you have the continuous glucose, a suppression in circulating glucose at those submaximal intensities, and then an increase in effort at those intensities as well. So it's very much the easiest way to monitor for it is in these during exercise. You can't really notice it before or after exercise really. So that's the best way to do it, I think. And I think you can kind of play around with it. So develop a warm up that pushes you, but you don't have to go to max, like 80% of max heart rate, which is about 60 to 70% of your max watts, let's say, in a bike test. That is sufficient to see these suppressions in heart rate. So I think that's a good
Okay, great, thank you. Another question from Eric L, or maybe a different Eric L, who's asking, what do you recommend for older, over 65 years, for example, athletes?
I tricky question. Once again, like as with this kind of idea that we don't have enough research on female athletes, we also don't have enough research on older athletes. That being said, I would say, and this might tie into Jim's question here, which is, are older athletes more susceptible to overtraining or REDs? I don't necessarily think so. I think that you do need to dial in your training relative to your ability to recover to that training. But whether or not you are more susceptible relative to a younger individual, I don't necessarily think so. I was actually talking with Melanie McQuaid, who's a 50-year-old professional triathlete. She raced Ironman, like Kona in the elite category. She's 50 years old, and she says that she's training harder than she ever has in her entire life. And that she thinks that a lot of this fear, this idea that she should just train less is just, that's all it is. It's fear. We don't have the, research to support that she should train less. And she's like, I can train just as hard or harder than I ever could. And it makes me feel better. So me as well. So I would say at this point in time, you do what you can handle and you individualize your training the same way anyone should individualize their own training. So.
Yeah, and different for everyone, right? And even just in those two questions, it was you that used the term older athlete, and one person saying over 65, and the other person saying over 40, over 40.
Yeah. Oh,
So,
yes,
yeah.
exactly. And I mean, the other thing that we talk about too is this idea, or even in physiology textbooks, we talk about this decrease in VO2 max over the age of, let's say, 35, you're going to have this systematic decrease in your VO2 max. And we're finding, athletes nowadays, 45, 50, their VO2 maxes are higher than any random 20-year-old that you test, right? So I think a lot of this is just we need to change our paradigm. We need to do more research, and I think that you can maintain fitness for a very long time.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of people are living, lives where they're a lot older, mobile, a lot older, certainly like healthier and active, a lot older now too than maybe in years past. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. And so you touched on Jim's question there as well. And we've got another one from another participant that's asking, has there been any research related to RDs and chronic fatigue syndrome?
Um, so okay, I'm gonna short answer, no. Long answer. So chronic fatigue syndrome very closely aligns with our understanding of overtraining syndrome because the symptoms are just that is the same symptoms essentially as your body's just unable to handle stress, unable to handle exercise at all at that point in time. Whereas with reds, it's not the same. The presentation of reds is very much all of those symptoms that we talked about. So you're going to see, stress fractures, you're going to see blood markers, hormone changes, you're going to see fluctuations in weight gain, changes in blood pressure and heart rate, but it's not this kind of overall chronic fatigue where you simply can't get out of bed in the morning. That's not what we see with reds. So I would say that they're different, and that chronic fatigue syndrome is more closely aligned with overtraining syndrome. And then now where we need to have more research is what is overtraining syndrome? Like I kind of think overtraining syndrome is chronic fatigue syndrome. and that we need to essentially do more research into chronic fatigue to try and figure out why some athletes might be presenting with it. But yeah, I would say that those two are decently separate.
Oh, great. Okay. Next question is from Ulrich Fischer, who asks, what sources are there for age-related energy requirements as a function of exercise? Is there a way to check for LE, etc., without frequent blood tests?
Very good question. So low energy availability. I think I will pull up this slide real quick. So this one, and this one, and I'm gonna go to this one. So, okay. Our optimal energy availability is in this 40 to 45 kilocalories per kilogram of fat-free mass per day range. So to calculate that, you do your energy intake. So let's say 2,000 calories over the day. You subtract your exercising energy expenditure, so maybe 800 calories from a big bike ride, and you divide that by your fat-free mass. And when you put that all together, you want to be and then also you should probably add in a couple extra exercising energy expenditure from walking around. So kind of your moving exercising energy expenditure. And when you do that math, you should be above 40 to 45 kilocalories per kilogram of fat-free mass per day to avoid some of these symptoms of low energy availability. If you're getting below this 30 to 35 kilocalorie range, now you are certainly at risk. So I think that an issue though with this and why I'm not a super fan of counting calories is just because you can't really do this with any sort of accuracy. And even if you're, in a research lab, and I will try to do this in my research lab, but even with, specialized equipment, maybe using doubly labeled water to get out the exercising energy expenditure, maybe literally providing my participants with meals to get their energy intake, even that, it's very tricky to get at the exact energy availability in this individual. So I think it's hard to measure. That being said, you can kind of do a big, like, an estimate, right? So most people are taking in a lot less calories than they should be. Not most, but most athletes who are training a decent amount, even if it's recreational athletes, they're probably taking in less calories than they should when you do this basic math. And so if you have just kind of an overall estimate, you can aim for, let's say it's saying, oh, I need to take in closer to 3,000 calories. It's good to have that reference point. I also think that you mentioned like age categories. We don't have that at this point in time. Although I would guess that it's going to be decently similar across age ranges. We do find that male athletes are a little bit more robust than females, so they can get away with lower energy availability before they start seeing symptoms. So male athletes, maybe this threshold becomes 30 or even 25 before you start seeing symptoms. So there is individual variability. That being said, yeah, you can kind of aim for this 40 to 45 to be safe, if you will. Stop share there. So I hope that answers that question. But yeah, regular blood tests, honestly, like 3 times a year, 2 to 3 times a year, that's what I would recommend if you are worried, if you're at all worried.
Great. And nice to have that extra visual and the math equation for people who want to get into that. That's awesome. Thank you. 2 questions now from Kevin Lenny. So the first was, you mentioned that you know several athletes diagnosed with overtraining syndrome and none of them returned to elite sport again. How many of those athletes were male and how many were female?
I can think of 3 female athletes and 1 male athlete. So definitely a higher prevalence of female athletes. Yep, and none of them, including the male athlete, none of them were able to return to elite sport. It just takes you like maybe these athletes would be able to recover sufficiently, but it takes so long. It takes years, many years. And then by that point in time, to get back into sport is tricky. And I have found, at least anecdotally, that they're not able to handle the same training loads as their teammates, even after they kind of hit that recovery. So it's very hard to get back into it.
Yeah, and probably a lot of other factors too, right? Just like I could imagine like maybe psychological or other factors that would be playing into that as
Yeah,
well.
exactly.
Great. Okay, and then the second question from Kevin. One study found greater arterial stiffness following 3 weeks of overloading. So the first part of the question is, how long did it take to recover or resolve the arterial stiffness?
Mm-hmm.
And then the second part of the question is, are they more vulnerable to arterial stiffness with future overloading?
Great question. So I believe in that study, and this was from my master's, so I apologize that I can't fully remember, but I believe they bounced back, the positive velocity bounced back within a week. So it was kind of an acute reaction to probably the increased sympathetic nerve activity. So they did have that vasoconstrictive response that lasted about a week. Whether or not they're vulnerable to future overloading, I don't know. And I think that's what ties into whether or not there's these long-term cardiovascular consequences of functional reaching, non-functional reaching or not. I would suspect that if this is happening frequently, you could have some of this kind of long-term maladaptation, if you will. That's where you start getting potentially some of this like calcification, fibrosis. So potential that it could cause long-term effects.
Okay, great. 2 really good questions there from Kevin. A couple questions, other questions left. So the next one is from Graham Fujisawa, and Graham is asking, are there any approachable FFM determinations that are easy to do, or do we need to bod pod? And
Oh,
I don't know what that means.
yeah. So fat-free mass, an assessment of your fat-free mass. So yeah, best way to do it would be to get an DEXA, which that's not very accessible. And then bod pod, good one. There are, I mean, you could do bioelectrical impedance. Those are so bad though. So that would be, you can get a scale where it estimates your percent body fat. I don't think it's a good way to go. If anything, I would almost, so this is terrible, but you can look at pictures on the internet of different body compositions, and you'd almost look at yourself and align it with these pictures. And I feel like that is a more accurate determination of fat-free mass than a scale. And so essentially, like female athletes, they're going to be about 20% plus of body fat, and male athletes will range, 10 to 20% body fat, depending on the caliber of athlete. But I think a lot of the time athletes like to think of themselves like, oh, I'm 5% body fat. That's not the case most times. And in general, your very fit female athletes are going to be around 20%. and then it'll just kind of go up from there. So that's my only recommendation. You can also do a skin fold assessment if you can find somebody who can do that. Exercise physiologists used to all be trained to do skin folds, but that's not a requirement anymore. So.
Great, interesting question from Graham. And then the last one that we have here is again from Brown Beer. So what specific elite sports were those athletes in, the ones that had to leave their sport?
I mean, this is all very personal. Like I've met 3 triathletes and 1 swimmer, I believe. Yeah. So definitely that endurance sport, and it's the endurance sports where people tend to train too much. I'm sure that you would see it in other sports, like such as I'm thinking rowing, triathlon, swimming, running almost to a lesser degree, simply because running, the training is dialed in a little bit better, and often you're worried more about injuries, you're worried more about stress fractures, kind of the red side, than you are the overtraining part of it. So less in running, but yeah, a lot of it is just these sports where people are training 2-3 times a day, high intensity almost every day, that type of stuff.
Yeah, good questions though, because I mean, those are also a lot of really accessible activities, like you mentioned running, but I mean, also cycling, swimming, like a lot of people are doing those activities, and easy to kind of maybe do more, get into a little bit more if they just want to start pushing themselves or set a new goal for competition or something different. And yeah, it's all good things to be aware of for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And I would
Okay.
say too, sorry, with the energy availability, that really is a risk in almost all sports. So we did a study looking at sprint power athletes, track athletes, so just sprinters, and we found, oh, I can't even remember. I want to say 60% of the female elite sprinters had markers of low energy availability. So kind of not what you'd expect. You expect this might be more of an endurance athlete thing, and it's not the case. And we're finding across all sports, all athletes are at risk of low energy availability.
Okay, well, there aren't any other questions coming through. There were a lot of really great questions for Alex, so thank you very much. And with that, I think we've reached the end of our time together for this evening. So many thanks to Dr. Alex Coates for sharing her expertise and knowledge, and many thanks to you all for joining us this evening. Have a great summer. Hopefully some of these tips can be integrated into, your athletics, training practices, and we'll hope to see some of you for the next Café Scientifique this fall. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.